In today's video, I'll be explaining the why behind how I use resistance bands, how you can use them at home, and some common mistakes that I typically see people doing on their own with resistance bands. What's up guys, my name is Nick Helton. I'm a physical therapist, and on this channel I typically talk about all things exercise, movement, and physical therapy. Today's video is going to be no different. We're going to be talking about resistance bands. Now, if you Google search resistance bands, you're going to find a lot of differing opinions, from people saying they are completely useless to people saying that they should be used for every exercise, and every single opinion in between. Today I'm going to dive into the why and sort of my opinion on what I think resistance bands are and are not useful for. So let's start off with the basics. What is a resistance band? A resistance band is simply just an elastic piece of equipment that provides, you guessed it, some degree of resistance to movement. Now there's all kinds of resistance bands out there, from the cheap rolls of resistance band that are typically given out in physical therapy for home exercises or for clients to take home and do on their own. There's closed loop resistance bands, which typically are a little bit more expensive and of varying sizes and thicknesses. And then there are your sort of premium products like the crossover symmetry, which I will get into talking about a little bit later. But suffice it to say, there's a wide variety of different types of resistance bands available. So how do they work? It's pretty simple. When you pull on the material, it provides some degree of resistance to being stretched. At the end ranges where it does not stretch anymore, that is as far as the material will expand. One of the biggest problems with that is there's a non-uniform resistance curve. What that means is essentially when you first pull on the band, there's very little resistance. So I'll demonstrate here. I've got just a simple blue TheraBand here. When I first pull on the band, there's almost no resistance here. So those first maybe ½ inch to an inch, there's very little resistance. Now that's with my hands being close. If I take them further out, there's almost no resistance right here. So you don't have uniform resistance to the range of motion. To further explain that, let me show you how a band pull apart exercise would look. So if I started very close with my hands together like this and I pull, I'm gonna very quickly get to the end range of where that material is going to allow me to go. However, if I start extremely wide and I go to pull, I can take this material all the way to the top of my chest and honestly even further without feeling too much resistance at the end range. To combat the lack of resistance that is provided when you pull all the way across, you really have two options. You get a stronger sort of band, so something that has a stronger material or is perhaps thicker, or you shorten the range of motion on your grip, right? Which that effectively limits the exercise's potential, i.e. you're not able to go further than a certain range of motion provided with a given band. So if you wanted to do something like pulling all the way to your chest, but this doesn't provide enough really stimulus or enough tension to challenge you, this is a pretty worthless exercise, and it's a pretty worthless piece of material for that specific movement. Really, to oversimplify it, the issue really is that it's difficult to provide a uniform resistance through a full range of motion with a band. It is relatively easy to progress, I guess, theoretically, in that you can get different types of bands to make it more challenging. However, its potential is extremely limited in that there's going to be a ceiling at which you're going to have to stop. I found a study from 2017 that was looking at using resistance bands as a way to sort of manual muscle test, which is not really relevant to what we're talking about, but within the study they did have this chart. So as you can see, the strongest band that they tested out came out to 31.7 pounds, which is for the strongest resistance that was available for that particular brand. Now there's a bunch of different brands and types, but for this specific one, 31.7 pounds was the upper limit. Objectively, 31.7 pounds is really not a lot of weight, especially if you think about, like, say, a rowing motion where someone might be doing 100 pounds, 200 pounds without major issue. 31.7 pounds is really just not enough weight to challenge a large portion of people. So if you look at this resistance band, it is definitely thick with 2 C's, but one of the problems is that the thicker it gets, the more difficult it is to try and expand. So if you're trying to increase the resistance, i.e. trying to get stronger, you're going to get to a point where the band is so thick that you can barely even expand it, which is going to limit a lot of what you're going to do. Like if you want to try and do a band pull apart, your motion is going to be severely limited because it is so challenging to use. However, that said, a great use of a band like this is for bodyweight exercises like pull-ups. Let me show you. Where should resistance bands not be used? The first one, and I think the most obvious one that I can think of, is using resistance bands as the only form of your resistance training. Bands are simply just not effective enough to be the only mode of training, the only tool that you use to train. We know that there is a huge benefit from weight-bearing exercises, from adding load to muscle, to tendon, to bone, to joint, and bands are simply just not effective in that regard. The next example is for movements that you readily have a simple solution for, like access to a cable weight machine, barbells, or any kind of free weights. If you have that access to those specific things, using a band in their place, again, it doesn't make much sense. The next instance is when the resistance band is unable to provide a muscular challenge to the given individual for a specific movement. Now, I know that sounds pretty obvious, but I've seen lots of cases in rehab where people are just given a band to do some rows and shoulder extensions and just told to do 100 reps or do it for 2 minutes or 3 minutes, when it really just is not a good enough challenge, especially when someone is further along in rehab and especially when someone is strong enough that a resistance band does not challenge them. And finally, when they should not be used is as a long-term solution. They're fine in the initial phases, they're fine to get someone exercising and get someone going, but I would not want them to be the long-term solution to any strength or exercise routine. Now, that said, let me add a simple caveat to everything that I just said. I will fully admit that resistance bands sometimes may be the only piece of exercise equipment in someone's home, and I do understand that the access and simplicity there is an argument for using them, and that's fine. It is better than nothing, right? There's an argument that someone is going to put it up in their house somewhere, they're going to see it all the time, they're going to have a dedicated area for exercise. That's great. So if that individual puts it up and is using it on a consistent basis, again, I understand the argument for using it in that case, but hopefully long term there is a progression. Another argument for it right now is availability. With everything going on in the world, there is some difficulty getting home gym equipment and access to that equipment, which is understandable. So at least the resistance band, again, gives them something, which is better than nothing. That said, if only bands were some sort of gateway drug into resistance training, I think we'd all be in a pretty good place. So where are some places that bands can be used effectively? I think they can be used effectively as a warm-up. Of course, this comes down to personal preference, and it's not a requirement to use them for a warm-up. And if you enjoy doing them for warm-up movements or as a prep for exercise, I think it's a great idea, a great sort of option to perform. To be the most effective, remember, try to mimic the movement that you're doing with the band when you're warming up, and also limit your warm-ups to a small percentage of your overall workout time. Your warm-up should never be longer than your actual workout. Another great place to use bands would be to add resistance to weighted movements. So for example, deadlifting or squatting, you can add them around the bar to provide resistance to lockout. I think that's a great effective way to utilize bands. Bodyweight movements, like I mentioned with the pull-ups, are another great way to use bands. And finally, potentially for some hypertrophy work where you're doing high repetitions, supersets, those sort of things where you're just trying to get a pump, get some blood into the muscle, I could see where they could be a useful argument for some sort of adjunctive training. Now to what I actually use them for in rehab and when I'm training people, really what I think is more effective than anything else. The first one is going to be a closed loop movement. So closed loop movements could be as simple as this band pull apart that I'm demonstrating here. The reason I like it is because both arms are pulling against each other, especially when dealing with specific rehab situations like a post-op shoulder surgery, where you're trying to work on some symmetric strength or at least build up one side compared to the other. The next situation I use them for is end range isometrics. So as I'm demonstrating here, this is a good way to try and regain some shoulder external range of motion. The idea is you're taking your shoulder out to end range, external range of motion, and then progressively walking away, which increases the challenge of the isometric. So you've taken the arm passively or actively to its full end range, and then you're trying to add some time under tension to that end range. A sort of subset variation of that would be a dynamic isometric. So the band is essentially going to be able to move freely in all directions and planes. So in this example, I'm holding that same position, but I'm moving vertically, I'm moving horizontally. I can add a superior and inferior lateral vector, all kind of different directions. I can increase the speed, I can hold for longer durations. So what I can do is really add a nice variety of movements. Another common way that I typically use the band for is to help with cueing. So for example, if someone's having a hard time with the cue of driving the knees out during a squat, what I'll do is I'll typically use the band to pull them into more of a valgus angle, if that's what I'm working on in that specific case, essentially giving them tactile feedback on how to engage against that movement. And along those same lines, putting a band underneath someone's foot with tension to show them when their foot rolls off the ground is another great external cue, especially for people who have trouble keeping their big toe down, rolling onto their lateral foot, or pushing up onto their toes. Having a band there with a bit of tension underneath, like I just demonstrated, is a great external cue and something they can do on their own and set up relatively easily. One last practical consideration is using the bands for increasing eccentric range of motion. So let's take shoulder flexion for this specific example. I've got the band attached high up, as you can see, and the idea is I allow the band to pull me into more overhead flexion while I'm sort of trying to control that motion. So I'm essentially getting a bit more of an active stretch, if you want to think of it like that, or a controlled eccentric. And then I can push into the band on the concentric and again, increase the amount of time that I'm kind of controlling that slow eccentric. The nice thing is, as I get closer to my end range of motion, there's less and less tension on the band. Whereas going the other way, you're going to have maximum tension on the most difficult spot to control, which is typically your end range for shoulder flexion in this specific example. That idea can be useful in the early phases of rehab, especially when you're trying to regain some degree of range of motion, or even potentially as a warm-up for someone who's trying to get more overhead flexion or more into that motion. The warm-up can add some cumulative time under tension for that specific movement. So there's a bunch of ideas for using resistance bands. They can be an extremely useful tool, but really the application and the context is the actual key. If you care or want resistance band recommendations, a lot of the bands you honestly see on Amazon are pretty much made in the same place. A lot of these cheaper bands that all look the same essentially just get rebranded in the same factory. I'll leave a few links below to the ones that I've found, but I don't know that there's any that are that much better than the others. They're all fairly similar at least in my opinion. If you're looking for the best overall solution, I'd recommend the crossover symmetry. I've got that link down below, and of course I've got a discount code. If you want to help out the channel, feel free to purchase it. If not, don't worry about it. I will be doing a full review on that system, but I think that that's probably the best overall system if you want some sort of resistance band setup that you can just set it and forget it and use it whenever you want. Thank you guys so much for watching. I appreciate you guys, and I'll see you in the next video.